She was lying in that bed, listening to the rain hit the window, and she knew. She knew the men outside weren't going to leave. She knew her husband had run out of options. Her name was Evelyn Grady. She was 78 years old. She had survived drought, debt, and the death of her only son. But tonight, in a farmhouse in the middle of Nebraska, with a failing heart and dangerous men parked in her yard, Evelyn was scared. And her husband Walter was already driving through the storm to find the only people he thought might still help. He didn't have much. An envelope with $317, every bill he could scrape together from the emergency drawer, the mason jar on the shelf, and his wallet. A wedding photograph from 1976. And a military medal that had once belonged to someone else, someone he carried with him every day even though that person had been gone for 12 years. Walter drove 20 minutes down a flooded county road, parked in front of a roadside diner called Patty's, and walked inside. At the corner table, 6 men in leather vests sat with cold coffee and hard faces. The biggest one looked up. His vest said one word, Reaper. Walter crossed the room, set the envelope on the table, and said the only thing he had left to say. Please. They're going to kill my wife tonight. Reaper opened the envelope. He counted the money. He looked at the photo. Then he picked up the military medal, and everything stopped. He went completely still. Not the way a man goes still when he's bored. The way a man goes still when something reaches him in a place he thought was sealed shut. He stared at that medal. His jaw tightened. When he finally looked up at Walter, his voice came out low and careful. Where did you get this? Walter started to answer. Reaper held up one hand and turned to the man beside him. Call everyone. The biker frowned. How many? Reaper set the medal down gently on the table. All of them. Before we go any further, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And if you're new here, hit that subscribe button right now so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Because this story is only just getting started. Millhaven, Nebraska. Population 340. A post office, a diner, a gas station, a church. The kind of town that people from cities fly over on their way somewhere else. Walter Grady's grandfather had broken the first soil there in 1921. 200 acres of corn and soybean. Walter grew up on that land, married Evelyn there in 1976, raised their son Daniel there, and buried Daniel there in the spring of 2011, under a white oak tree in the back corner of the property that Daniel used to climb as a boy. Every single morning for 12 years since, Walter walked out to that grave before breakfast. Before coffee. Before chores. Before anything. That is how you understand what the farm meant. That is why he could not leave. Evelyn had been the center of that family for 48 years, quietly, completely, without any need for recognition. She kept the books when Walter's eyesight started failing. She held herself together at Daniel's funeral because Walter wasn't able to, and fell apart later, alone, when nobody needed her to be strong. By the time of our story, her heart was failing. Her cardiologist had told Walter plainly, in a hospital hallway, that sustained stress could end her life. Not eventually. Quickly. Walter drove home from that appointment and sat in his truck for a long time before going inside. He never told Evelyn what the doctor said. He just started doing everything he could to keep the weight off her. Which made what happened next almost unbearable. His name was Derek Voss. He showed up in Millhaven 14 months earlier in a clean truck with a company logo and a business card that said Regional Development Partners. He sat at Walter's kitchen table and made an offer for the land. Walter said no. Voss came back with a higher offer. Walter said no again. Then came the fence torn down on the eastern field. A small barn fire Walter caught early. 3 chickens found dead in the yard with no explanation. Evelyn's bedroom window cracked at 2 in the morning. And every time Walter went to Sheriff Lloyd Baxter, the same result, a report taken, a promise made, nothing done. The 4th visit, Baxter didn't even reach for a notepad. Walter drove home and understood. He was alone in this. What Walter didn't know was why Voss wanted that specific land so badly. 18 months before approaching Walter, Voss had commissioned a private geological survey. Beneath the Grady property, beneath 300 feet of Nebraska soil, lay natural gas pockets and mineral deposits estimated at $40 to $60 million in commercial value. Voss didn't want the land. He wanted what was under it. Sheriff Baxter had received $11,000 in cash payments to make sure nothing Walter reported ever went anywhere. On the night of October 14th, 4 of Voss's men parked in Walter's yard at sundown with their engines running and headlights pointed at the house. Walter sat at his kitchen window watching those lights for 2 hours. Then he drove to Patty's Diner. Now you need to understand Reaper. His real name was Ray Kane. He grew up in Tulsa, the son of a mechanic, mother gone when he was 7. He enlisted at 19, did 2 tours in Afghanistan, came back with shrapnel in his left thigh and a quietness his father noticed and didn't push. He found the Iron Saints through a fellow veteran and never really left. He became president of the Tulsa chapter in 2015 and held it since, not famous, not feared the way movies suggest, just serious, disciplined, and loyal in a way that most organizations never manage to be. The Iron Saints had chapters in 8 states. Veterans, mechanics, former addicts rebuilding their lives. The code Reaper held to was simple: you do not walk away from someone who needs what you can give. The medal in Walter's envelope was a combat action ribbon, Reaper's own, from October 2009, outside a forward operating base in Kandahar province. His unit had been ambushed in a narrow alley. 2 men pinned down, 1 badly wounded. A soldier from a different unit heard the firefight and came back in, not because he was ordered to, but because he chose to. He pulled Reaper out from behind a burning vehicle, went back for the wounded man, took a fragment in his left shoulder on the second trip, and kept moving until all 5 men were out. Reaper had pressed the ribbon into that soldier's hand afterward, unable to find the right words. He had spent 3 years after coming home trying to find the man's name through VA records and veteran networks. He found it in 2014. PFC Daniel Grady, Millhaven, Nebraska. Killed in action, March 2011. Reaper had sat with that debt for 9 years, knowing it could never be repaid directly. And then Daniel's father walked into a diner in the rain and set the medal on a table in front of him. There are moments that feel like the universe insisting on something. This was one of them. Within 12 hours, riders were moving toward Millhaven. Reaper made 15 calls standing in Patty's parking lot in the rain. Those became 60 calls by morning. The message was direct: a family in Nebraska needed protection. The father of a man who had died saving one of their own. Reaper was asking everyone who could ride to come. By Thursday morning there were 34 men at the Grady farm. By Friday evening, nearly 90. By Saturday dawn, 112, from Kansas, Missouri, Oklahoma, Iowa, Colorado, Wyoming. Men who had taken days off work, called in favors, driven through the night. That is what brotherhood looks like when it isn't just a word. It looks like 100 men moving toward a farm in October because some things matter, and this was one of them. Evelyn saw them for the first time Thursday morning from her bedroom window. 16 men in leather vests working quietly in the drizzle, fixing fence, stacking firewood, clearing barn debris. Nobody talking much. Nobody needing to. She watched for a long time, then walked to the kitchen, put the kettle on, and started making scrambled eggs. Walter came in and said, "You're supposed to be resting." She said, "I'm not a child, Walter. Open the back door." She fed men in rotating shifts that morning from a table that had never seen so much traffic. She learned names. Gary, the mechanic from Kansas City. Andre, the combat medic from St. Louis who checked her blood pressure before she could tell him not to. Tommy, the quiet one from Oklahoma who ate fast and went straight back to work. That was Evelyn. Even now, even sick, that was her. But something was wrong inside the group. On Wednesday night Reaper had told only his core circle which road to use for farm access. At 2 in the morning Thursday, one of Voss's trucks drove slowly past that exact road with its lights off. Reaper had been awake in the tree line, old field habit, and he watched it pass. He went back to the barn and sat in the dark. Someone in his group was talking to the other side. Cole Decker was 26, patched in 18 months ago through the southern chapter, good with engines, always eager. Nobody had looked closely at the fact that his younger sister worked as a receptionist at Voss's development company. Cole wasn't a bad person. He was scared of arrests, federal attention, consequences, and he had convinced himself that passing general information to a contact at Voss's company wasn't real betrayal. Just self-protection. He had given them the access road, the number of men, and Walter's medication run schedule into town. He had told himself each time that he was only giving information, not telling them what to do with it. On Friday night, he found out what they did with it. Voss's men cut the power line to the farmhouse at midnight. They knew exactly where it ran. In the sudden darkness, Evelyn's cardiac monitor lost power and its backup battery failed to alarm. Andre Washington reached her 40 seconds later, light sleeper, combat medic instinct, one ear always toward the house. He stabilized her in the dark. She pulled through. But Walter, standing in the doorway with a flashlight, looking at his wife in the beam of light while she held Andre's hand, something cracked open in him that he had been holding shut for months. Reaper put one hand briefly on Walter's shoulder, said nothing, and went back outside. When he called the core team together in the yard, his voice was level. He said, "Someone in this group has been talking. We find out who. Tonight." He didn't have to look long. 2 hours later, Cole Decker stood up from the back of the barn and walked to the front and handed Reaper his phone without saying anything first. On the phone were 3 saved voice messages from his contact at Voss's company. Specific, detailed, damning, including references to the mineral rights, to the sheriff's name, and to the amounts paid. Cole had saved them as insurance, he said. He wasn't sure against what. Maybe he had always known it would end here. He looked at Reaper and said, "I'm sorry. I know that's not enough. But they're all on there." Reaper listened to the messages. He looked at Cole for a long time. Then he said, "Sit down. We'll deal with this later." He meant both parts equally. "Here is the question I need to ask you right now." Cole was scared. He had a sister on the other side who didn't know what her boss was doing. He told himself he wasn't hurting anyone. And then his choices nearly killed an old woman with a failing heart in the dark of her own bedroom. Do you think fear makes betrayal forgivable? And does what he did at the end, walking forward, handing over the phone, not running, does that change anything for you? Drop it in the comments. I'm genuinely reading every one. Saturday morning. Cold and clear. 6:20 a.m., Walter's phone rang from an unknown number. A smooth, professional voice told him Evelyn had been moved somewhere safe. She would be returned the moment Walter signed the property transfer. He had 30 minutes. Walter said nothing. He walked to her bedroom. Window open 3 inches. Bed empty. He came back and looked at Reaper across the kitchen. 2 words. She's gone. What followed was controlled and fast. Reaper laid it out. Voss had one industrial property in the county that fit, a former grain processing facility 12 miles east of Millhaven, fenced, remote, purchased 3 years ago and barely used. One of the brothers had scouted it earlier in the week. That was where Evelyn was. Rules were stated clearly: no weapons beyond what was already legally carried, no threats of violence, no property damage. They would show up, stand there, and make it impossible for this to stay private. A journalist at an Omaha TV station named Beth Calloway had been tracking Voss's land acquisitions for 2 years. She would meet them there. Cole Decker was told to ride in the last truck and stay in the vehicle. At 7:15, 112 motorcycles pulled east out of the fields around the Grady farm. The column stretched for nearly a mile. Patty Hollins heard them from inside the diner, stepped out in her apron, and stood on the gravel watching until the last one passed. She said later it was the most beautiful thing she'd ever seen. Not because of the bikes. Because of what they meant. Voss was inside the processing facility with 2 employees and no real security. He had assumed Walter would fold quickly once Evelyn was gone. He had not planned for 100 motorcycles, a news camera, or 3 Millhaven residents parked along the shoulder watching. Reaper walked to the gate alone when the engines cut and the silence landed. He said it simply: an elderly woman with a heart condition was being held on this property and needed to be released immediately. A news camera was recording from the road. This was no longer a private matter. He said it once and stepped back. Voss came outside trying to control the situation the way he always had, hands open, measured voice, practiced calm. He looked at the line of bikes. He looked at the camera. And you could see the moment the calculation changed behind his eyes. What he didn't see was Cole Decker climbing out of the last truck in the column and walking to Beth Calloway's vehicle. Cole knocked on the window and handed her his phone. She put on headphones and listened for 90 seconds. Then she nodded to her camera operator. The recordings went to air on the noon broadcast, Voss's own voice, on his own voicemail, describing the scheme, naming the sheriff, quoting the amounts paid. In his own words. Because he had been confident for too long to be careful. Sheriff Baxter arrived shortly after. He stepped out of his cruiser, assessed the scene, and did not move from beside his vehicle. A state trooper from a neighboring county, called in by Beth Calloway's station the night before, arrived 2 minutes behind him and walked to Voss. There was a short conversation. Then the side door of the building opened and Evelyn Grady stepped out in her cardigan, squinting in the morning light. Cold, frightened, and furious in the way that a woman of her character gets furious when she's been underestimated. She walked out under her own power. Walter was moving before his truck stopped. 40 yards of gravel, bad hips, bad knees, none of it mattered. Evelyn saw him coming and put her hand out. He reached her and took it. They stood there together while everything sorted itself out around them. She looked up at him and said quietly, "I knew you'd come." Walter held her hand and didn't say a word. Some things have already been said by 48 years of showing up. The camera caught that moment, Two old people standing together in the morning light while 100 bikers watched in silence. That image ran everywhere. Because it was real. Because you could feel it through a screen. The rest moved fast. Voss was detained that morning. Beth Calloway's story hit 2 national wire services by Sunday. The Nebraska State Attorney General opened an inquiry by Tuesday. Sheriff Baxter resigned Monday morning, citing personal reasons, and was indicted 8 weeks later on bribery and obstruction charges. 2 other families from neighboring counties came forward within 30 days. The mineral rights scheme collapsed under its own paperwork. The Iron Saints stayed 4 more days. They finished the fence, repaired the barn roof, replaced the power line properly. On Tuesday morning they gathered in the yard at sunrise. All 112 of them. Walter came out in Daniel's jacket. Evelyn stood beside him, steadier than she'd been in months. Walter looked out at those men and said, "I don't have the words." Reaper said, "Your son would have done the same for any one of us." Walter nodded. Pressed his lips together. That was enough. Cole Decker was suspended from club activities for 6 months and spent that time volunteering at a veterans outreach program. Whether the recordings redeemed the damage his earlier choices caused is something the men of the Iron Saints still disagree on. Betrayal leaves a mark even when it's partially repaired. That's just true. Evelyn lived 16 more months. She passed the following February, at home, with Walter's hand in hers. Before she went, she told him to stop pretending everything was okay when it wasn't. She had always known. He said he knew. She said she loved him for trying anyway. The farm was placed in a permanent agricultural land trust by a pro bono attorney who read the story and called the same week. The back corner, the white oak tree, Daniel's grave, written into the document specifically. Protected forever. Walter placed a second small flag there after Evelyn passed. He said she had earned her spot. In the Iron Saints chapter house in Tulsa, there is a photograph on the wall in a plain wood frame. 112 men in the early morning light outside a barn in Nebraska. Below it, taped to the frame, a piece of paper in plain block letters, because Danny showed us what family means. Let me leave you with this. Walter Grady drove through a rainstorm with $300, a wedding photo, and a dead man's medal. He walked across a diner floor to a table full of strangers and asked for help. That walk cost him more than anything else in this story. Not the years of harassment. Not the fight with Voss. That walk, because Walter had spent 81 years being the person other people leaned on, and asking for help himself was the hardest thing he had ever done. But he did it. And because he did, Evelyn came home. Daniel's grave was protected. A corrupt sheriff and a predatory developer faced real consequences. And 100 men got the chance to repay a debt they'd been carrying for 12 years without knowing it. All of that came from one man being willing to walk across a room and say, "I need help." Think about whether there is something in your own life you've been trying to carry alone. Think about the people around you who might be doing the same. And think about whether you would stand up for someone being pushed off the only thing they had left, even if it cost you something real. What's your take on this? Comment below. I'm reading every single one. If this story resonated with you, hit the like and send it to someone who needs to hear it. And if you want more stories like this, check out the previous videos on the channel. They're right there waiting.